Now we're going to ask Lindsay to come and to read.
It's from Mark chapter 5, verses 21 to 42. Jesus raises a dead girl and heals a sick woman. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She'd suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I'll be healed." Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who'd done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child isn't dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha koum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. World's longest reading over, and Alex is going to come share on it.
Brilliant, thank you, Lindsay. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I think you all know that my name is Alex. I can't see anybody new here today. So the miracle, or rather the miracles of Jesus that we're going to be looking at today are a woman restored and then a daughter healed. Firstly, we're going to look at the context of these miracles. Secondly, what actually happens in the text. And then next, we're going to compare and contrast the characters in the story. And then lastly, we're going to look at what God may be saying to us today. So firstly, what is the context of these miracles? These miracles of Jesus happen just after Jesus heals a man who everyone thought could not be cured. Jesus had got in a boat and he had travelled across the Sea of Galilee, cast out the spirit of a man who was living chained up in a graveyard. And then our passage starts by saying, Jesus got into the boat again and went back and was met by a large crowd who gathered around him on the shore. It would appear that the crowd had been waiting for him. So what happens in our passage? In the text, we have two healings that are intertwined, and it is impossible to look at one without looking at the other. So, as well as looking at each healing, we're going to look at how they interact and compare and connect with one another. Everything that Jesus did, he did for a reason. There is a reason that these two healings are intertwined with one another. So Jesus crosses back over the Sea of Galilee and he's met by the crowd waiting for him at the shore. And then next, a leader of the local synagogue, whose name was Jairus, arrived. Now, Jairus would have been really well known within his community. He would have been well known and well respected, and he would have had power and authority within his community. And when Jairus saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, pleading fervently with him, and fervently meaning enthusiastically and passionately. Now, this act of Jairus falling at the feet of Jesus should not be overlooked. Jairus was used to, in his community, showing him the respect, not the other way around. He knew that Jesus was someone really special. Furthermore, it's actually against Jewish law to bow to anyone except God. And Jairus wasn't doing this in private. He was doing this in front of a crowd of people. And why was he doing this? Why was he acting in a way that someone in his position just would not have done? Because of his daughter. Jairus says to Jesus, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and lay hands on her and heal her so she can live." In this moment, Jairus' position and his authority are irrelevant. He was just a father. He was a dad, completely overcome with the need to save the life of his little girl. And at that moment, when his daughter is dying, instead of being with his dying daughter, Jairus is here on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, begging Jesus to come with him and lay his hands on his daughter and heal her. The faith in Jesus that Jairus is showing here is immense. I mean, I know that when my children are ill, I just don't want to leave their side. There's been many times over the years when they've just had a temperature and I've literally slept on the floor just so I can be close to them if there's a problem. And then there's been time when there has been a real problem and I haven't been able to be with them and I just couldn't get to them. And it was excruciating. Like, it actually hurt. I felt sick with worry. I was frantic and pacing and panicking, just needing to be with them. For this dad to leave his daughter's side when he knows that she's actually dying, that shows immense faith in Jesus. And it's actually pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. Jairus' faith was bigger than his fear. And what does Jesus do? How does Jesus react to this really important man pleading at his feet, and then the alarming situation of a young girl at the brink of death? The text simply says, "So Jesus went with him." But it wasn't that easy. It would appear that Jesus tried to go with him, but the crowd was there and they pressed in against him. And now this is where we're introduced to our next main character in this situation. First, we have the powerful and well-respected synagogue leader, Jairus. And now we have a woman who has been bleeding for 12 years. And she's actually so seemingly insignificant that we don't even know her name. Now, in this culture at this time, women were second-class citizens at the best of times. And furthermore, when it was a woman's time of the month, she was deemed even less worthy. She was deemed unclean. Unclean meaning unholy, and this was so very important in this culture. Now, the first 5 books of the Old Testament are the Torah. The law of God was revealed to Moses and recorded in the Torah. So in Leviticus, which is the second of these books, in 15:19 to 23, it says, "When a woman has her monthly period, she is unclean for 7 days. Anyone who touches her will be unclean until evening." And then it goes on to say that if anyone touches anything that she has touched, they too will be unclean. And then if a woman bleeds longer than 7 days, she is unclean for the whole time she is bleeding. Plus, it also says that a woman is also deemed unclean for an additional 7 days after she's finished bleeding, just to ensure that she really is clean. Now, a woman was also required to perform rituals to ensure that she is now really clean. Now, this kind of unclean was known as niddah, and when literally translated, niddah means physical separation, as that is what was required. It was actually quite normal for a woman to live in a different part of the house to her husband whilst she was deemed unclean, so that she didn't contaminate him or contaminate the things that he could come into contact with. I can't imagine living like that, with people having to purposely and physically avoid me. So what about our bleeding woman? What would life have been like for her? Now, this woman had been bleeding for 12 years non-stop. This would mean that she was a complete social outcast. She would have experienced complete physical separation from society for 12 years. It's unimaginable. People would see her and they would literally back away in fear of being deemed unclean by association. What a sad and lonely life she must have lived. So our bleeding woman, she's in the crowd that was pressing around Jesus as he attempted to go with Jairus to heal his daughter and stop her from dying. The text actually tells us that not only had this woman suffered from constant bleeding, but that she had also suffered a great deal from many doctors, and over the years she had spent everything she had to pay them. But she had gotten no better. In fact, she had gotten worse. I just can't imagine what life would have been like for this poor woman, reaching out for help and actually ending up in a worse situation than she was before. Actually, thinking about it makes me quite emotional. Her life must have been miserable. She must have been miserable. And I say that because I know that if I was her, if I had her life, that my mental health would not be in a good place at all. In fact, I'm pretty certain that if I had her life, I would be in a very dark place indeed. But our bleeding woman, she had heard about Jesus. She had heard about Jesus and she pursued him. And because of this, her life was about to change. She was supposed to avoid contact with others, but she was not doing this. Our bleeding woman, she was in a crowd. And as the crowd were pressing in on Jesus, then for her to succeed in her mission and be able to touch the robe of Jesus, she would be pressing up against those around her. And she was actually in quite a dangerous position. Can you imagine the reaction of the crowd who were bustling and pushing to get to Jesus if somebody recognised her? This would not be good news for her at all. In fact, I would imagine that the potential reaction of the crowd could have put our bleeding woman in actual physical danger. But all she could think was, if I can just touch his robe, I will be healed. She decided that she had to do this. The determination, the bravery, and the immense faith that our bleeding woman showed. To me, she's just totally inspirational. I'm pretty sure that if I had her life, I would be curled up in a ball somewhere, hiding from the world and feeling very sorry for myself indeed. But our bleeding woman, her faith was bigger than her fear. So what happens next? The text tells us that immediately the bleeding stopped and she could feel in her body that she had been healed. I just can't imagine what that moment must have been like for her. Can you? The text tells us that at once Jesus realised that power had gone from him. Immediately Jesus knew. So he asked the crowd, "Who touched me?" Our bleeding woman, knowing that she had been healed when she touched Jesus' robe, knew that Jesus was referring to her, and she fell at his feet. The text tells us that she was trembling with fear. I wonder what she was afraid of. Maybe she was scared about what Jesus' reaction was going to be. It's possible. Maybe she was scared of speaking up in front of the crowd. Maybe she was scared of the crowd's reaction to her being there in public. Maybe it was fear of both. But whatever the reason, she was so afraid that she was physically trembling, and she fell at the feet of Jesus and told him everything that happened. In a short space of time, Jesus had two people who could not be more different from one another at his feet. Jairus, a synagogue leader, pleading passionately, and now our no longer bleeding woman, trembling with fear. And how does Jesus react? "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." I absolutely love this line. It's actually one of my favourites. I wasn't going to share this, but I'm going to share it. I'll try and be really quick. The reason that this line is so important to me is when I was a new Christian and Grace was really small, my mum had paid for Grace and I to go to Spring Harvest with them, and I wasn't in a very good place. I would say I was a Christian, but I was still very, very damaged. And I was if anyone's been to Spring Harvest, it's like a big tent, a big top where everyone worships and praises. It's amazing. I was really miserable and I couldn't sit with everybody, and each night I would go and sit up in the far corner on my own. I didn't want to be around everybody, and all I could see everywhere were happy couples and happy families, and I just felt so sad. And actually I walked out of the Big Top meeting and I went and I sat at the beach and I was crying my eyes out. I remember it was awful. I felt so lonely and just so broken, and it was awful. But I had my Bible with me, and I felt like God was telling me to read my Bible. So I opened it up, and it was this sentence that was there, and it literally jumped off the page. "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Now go in peace. Be freed from your suffering." And like that, I felt peace. And obviously it was a miracle, because it was like all of the yuckiness had gone. And I remember I went back into the meeting at Spring Harvest, and for the first time I was able to put my hands up in the air and worship. Up until that point my hands had been very firmly at my side. But for the first time I could actually praise. Anyway, let me get back to the story. So the one thing I love about it is that Jesus calls our woman daughter. Now that one woman, daughter, in that moment, with that first word, Jesus hasn't just healed her physically, he has restored her. Before her encounter with Jesus, she was an outcast. People had to be physically separated from her. But with one word, Jesus has removed the label unclean and has restored her position in society by calling her his daughter. Interestingly, the story of our bleeding woman is in 3 out of the 4 Gospels, and in each one, Jesus says the same thing, or words to that effect, depending on which translation you're reading. And this woman, our bleeding woman, is the only individual that Jesus refers to as daughter in the whole of the Bible. Jesus is just so very special. Jesus chose probably the lowest female member of that community and raised her up to the status of daughter of the Son of God. With that one word, he showed her love, and he showed her kindness and respect and belonging. With that one word, Jesus gave her credibility, and he gave her permission to be there. Jesus restored her. And then Jesus says, "Your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." It was not our bleeding woman touching the robe of Jesus that healed her. It wasn't any physical act. It was her faith. And then Jesus speaks peace and freedom over her. First, he restores her physically. Then he restores her socially. And then most importantly, he restores her spiritually. I would love to know how this woman's life changed after this encounter with Jesus. Unfortunately, the Bible doesn't tell us, but I can guarantee you that because her faith was bigger than her fear, because she pursued Jesus, because she encountered Jesus, and because she was restored by him, her life would never be the same again. And no one ever is after a true encounter with our living God. So, what happens next? The text says that whilst Jesus was still speaking, people from Jairus' house arrive and tell Jairus that his daughter is dead, followed by, "Why bother the teacher anymore?" The Bible doesn't tell us exactly who the people are, but that they are there to deliver the worst possible news. And then they follow the worst possible news with, "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Obviously, we don't know what tone it was said, but it definitely doesn't come across in a positive way, because bothering someone is never a positive thing. Maybe, if she'd still been alive, they would have been more supportive of Jairus speaking to Jesus, but it is clear that now she is dead, they think that no good could come from the conversation continuing. We don't know who they were or what they were thinking, but Jesus did. Do not be afraid, just believe, he says. Jesus is telling the people from Jairus' house to have faith. He is telling them for their faith to be bigger than their fear. Now next, Jesus went to Jairus' house, and there he saw the family mourning for the young girl. "The child is not dead, but asleep," he told them. But they replied with laughter. So then Jesus got everyone else to leave except the mother, the father, and the disciples, and he said, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." And just like that, she got up, walked around, and Jesus told them not to tell anyone and to get her some food. I just can't imagine what that would have been like for Jairus and his wife. They thought that she was dead. She had been dead, and here she was now, walking around, looking for food. Now we're going to look at the characters, followed by what God may be saying to each of us today. Firstly, I think it's really important that the healing of Jairus' daughter and the restoration of the bleeding woman are presented together. The fact that these two stories are being presented together has a real contrasting effect. They could have been shared in the Bible as separate miracles or one told without the other, but Mark, the writer, he was selective about what stories he chose to share in the gospel. So clearly he wants each miracle to be understood in connection with the other. Of course, on their own, they are remarkable, but together they're even more powerful. So what are the similarities? In both miracles, Jesus was ministering to women, within itself is a big deal. And both of these women are in the most desperate of circumstances. Both are barely living, but of course in different ways. Both are severely ill, one incurably ill and the other terminally ill. Another thing that links these women is the number 12. Our bleeding woman has been bleeding for 12 years. And right at the end of the text, we are told that Jairus' daughter is 12 years old. Now, the biblical interpretation of the number 12 is that it is considered a perfect or complete number, and it symbolises God's power and authority. So what about the contrast? So obviously the main difference between the two is that Jesus heals is their social status. Their lives literally could not be more different. Our bleeding woman is a complete social outcast and living in physical separation from the rest of society. And Jairus' daughter, due to her father's job, would have been very privileged indeed. And what about Jairus and the bleeding woman? People would see Jairus and they would want to speak to him. They would want to be seen talking to him. They would treat him with respect and high regard. They would see him and they would want to please him. And our bleeding woman, an outcast. People would see her and they would most likely ignore her. They most definitely wouldn't want to be seen talking to her. They would treat her with disrespect and disregard. They would see her and her feelings would most likely have been irrelevant. Two people at complete opposite ends of the societal spectrum. Their lived experience and interactions with the world around them were polar opposite, in complete contrast with one another. So what's God saying to us today? 3 things, but it's going to be super quick. The first thing that stands out is how desperate both of these situations were. In both situations, it appeared that there was no way out. In both situations, it seemed like there was no resolution to be found, no light at the end of the tunnel. But that was the state of the situations without Jesus. However, once our bleeding woman and Jairus allowed their faith to be bigger than their fear, once they both pursued Jesus, and once they both invited Jesus into these desperate situations, these situations that were once filled with despair were now filled with hope. The second thing that really stood out was obviously the huge difference in the status of the individuals. I think it's no accident that one daughter is healed and is brought back to life, and our bleeding woman is raised up to the status of daughter and is given a new life. I think God is saying that it doesn't matter what your life is like or what your position in life is. It doesn't matter if you are a leader or if you're seen as the lowest of the low or if you're anywhere in between. Jesus doesn't look at position, he looks at the person. Jesus looks at the person and he looks at their heart. And for those that have faith in their hearts, no matter who you are, he offers hope. The third and final thing is how Jesus treated the bleeding woman. The rest of society avoided her. Physical separation was deemed completely necessary. But Jesus didn't care about that. Yes, according to Jewish law, she was unclean, but Jesus came to fulfill the law. In Matthew 5:7, Jesus says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law of the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." Jesus is saying that the law still stands, but because of him, those that have faith are made clean because of him. The simple fact is that on our own, none of us are clean. None of us are worthy. None of us are holy. But if we have faith, then even the most unclean, the most unworthy, the most unholy person is made worthy in Jesus. If we have faith in Jesus, then through his blood, we are all cleansed of everything that makes any of us unclean or unworthy to be in God's presence, so that we are able to be with him for eternity. Through Jesus' worthiness, we are all made worthy. And the question that I'm going to leave you all with today is your faith bigger than your fear? We're going to watch a quick video, please.
Faith. It's more than just believing without seeing. It's more than just a stirring or a feeling. Faith, it has a deeper meaning. See, faith is profound. I mean, it's what raised a man up from the ground. It's what tells us we are no longer bound to these shackles and these fears. Faith tells us that God is always near to the brokenhearted and to the torn. Faith tells us that we have been reborn. Faith is like an anchor that keeps us grounded when we feel surrounded by the chaos and the noise, and when we start to lose our identity, trying to be what society wants us to be. That's when faith calls out to us loud and clear, reminding us of why we are here. Faith, it gives us purpose. That every time our heart beats in our chest, we are reminded who created it. And if you lack faith, if you have your questions and your doubts, I'm here to tell you today that that is okay. That doubt is not the opposite of faith, but the opposite of faith is self-sufficiency. It's thinking that we can live our life alone, not in need of the throne. We seek the fame, the glory, and to be known, and maybe control of your life is what you seek. But the only reason why you have your life is because a man thought you were worth the sacrifice. See, faith gives us peace. Faith gives us rest. Faith will change your life, I confess. Faith tells us not to lose heart. Faith gives us a brand new start. Faith tells us we will never go hungry or never go thirsty. And faith tells us that Jesus will give us his unconditional love and mercy. So when life puts a mountain in front of you, faith tells that mountain to move. And when the walls of Jericho feel like they are surrounding you, faith says those walls will come crumbling down. And when you feel too weak to walk, faith says get up and go. See, having faith is more than just saying I believe. It's a commitment. It's vowing to live a life that is different. So I ask you today, I have faith. Are those 3 words enough for you to change your life around? Are those 3 words enough for you to live a life that's profound?